All right, so like we do in every session, we're going to start with review. Okay, we started off this whole chapter with the biological approach, right? So, remember what the biological approach is?
I remember the studies from the biological approach, which was the first one was dement and something. It was about the sleep and the dreams. It was that study, and the study about the monkey torture centers.
Yeah.
And Hosel, I think, about mindfulness and brain scans. And
yeah,
basically those were the three studies. I still haven't memorized the names for which one, but I remember which one is which and what they're about.
We will work on coming up with acronyms for that. So you association.
But yeah. And basically the biological approach is that psychologists believe that behavior and cognitions and emotions can be explained in terms of working, in terms of how the brain works, and the effects of hormones and genetics.
Absolutely.
And evolution.
Yeah, that's the thing you need to remember, that they emphasize the fact that there are physiological factors that impact your behavior and your mental practice. Okay, that's good. Good. Now we'll move on to the cognitive approach. What do you remember about the cognitive approach?
The cognitive approach, it was basically...
It has to do with the brain. Cognition always has to do with the brain.
Right. Hang on. The cognitive approach, I remember that it's about how information is processed through the same input and output process in all different humans. And it was about individual differences in cognitive processing, such as attention and language and memory. Mostly memory we covered, I think, right?
Exactly, yep. We covered a lot of the studies were to do with memory, yeah. And
it's the process of how human behavior can be explained through the brain.
Exactly, through the workings of the brain. That's good. And we also talked about a few studies in this section. Do you remember the doodling study that we talked about?
The doodling study, yeah, how doodling can help you concentrate.
Concentrate, absolutely. And then we did this eye test, how you can identify emotions, how well people with autism especially can identify emotions. And do you remember the lineup experiment?
Pardon?
The lineup experiment, do you remember that one?
The lineup experiment. What was the experiment called again?
It was Pazzulo et al., where they lined up a few either cartoon characters or actual people, and they saw how well children and adults could recognize if they were present or missing from the lineup.
I remember the eye test one, and I remember the doodling one.
Okay, this one was to do with a concept called confabulation, where we sometimes fill in the gaps.
Right.
I think when we review again, if you will recall that. Okay, so far so good. So what do you remember about the learning approach?
The learning approach, I remember that it's about how experiments and interactions with the environment shape behavior, such as nature and nurture, for example. And through classical conditioning, social conditioning, and there was one more which was operational.
Yes, absolutely. And we talked about how behavior can be learned with positive or negative reinforcement, right? Or if you associate two stimuli with each other. Remember, stimuli is something that initiates a response in you. It can be negative or positive. And when you associate two together, like the elephant experiment that we talked about, behavior can be learned. So in this section, we also talked about aggression. Do you remember the aggression experiment?
Yeah, it was Bandura, I think. Bandura?
Yeah, absolutely, yep.
You know how I remember that? Bandura in Arabic means tomato. So I remember as a tomato study.
Oh wow, that's good. I'm glad you made an association. Then I
Yeah,
will
I don't know
remember.
this one. Yeah. I need to work on chapter 1.
So with that, we talked about how people are willing to be aggressive when there is a role model telling them to do so. And then the elephant experiment we talked about. And then there was one study about classical conditioning. You remember the boy with the button phobia?
Yeah.
The boy with the button phobia, how they used operational conditioning to reinforce feeling of positivity when he actually let go of his disgust for the button to his mother, remember? Yeah, and then the last approach we talked about was the social approach. Do you remember the social approach?
Social.
I can't hear you again. I think your mic might be muted or...
My phone started ringing.
No problem. No problem at all. Alright, so we were talking about the social approach.
Yeah, so for the social approach, it was basically how emotions are influenced by social contexts, like social environments and groups, and and how behavior, cognitions, and emotions are influenced by the presence of like other people.
So
basically affects other people, right?
Yeah. And this is the part where we talked about the Milgram obedience study. You remember when you're supposed to cause pain to a stranger? And we talked about the personal space study from Perry. And then we talked about the subway Samaritan. Do you remember that study?
Can you repeat what you said?
Do you remember the subway Samaritan study with Gilligan?
American City for social approach?
When they did an experiment in the train, you remember that one?
Was it Perry?
It was Piliban. Piliban.
Oh, Piliban. Oh,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
The subway Samaritans. Okay. Yeah. Basically, what's the question?
Like, do you remember what went on in that study and what we were studying?
How the presence of other people discourage a person from helping or intervening in an emergency or like a public situation, right?
Perfect. Yep.
Yeah.
So
okay.
That's good. You have a good grasp on all of the approaches. Okay. So now we're gonna move on to the research methodology. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Great.